Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback.
Towards the end of May, we are probably getting to the point where we might be thinking about that first cutting of hay. And one important thing to always remember is that as maturity goes up, tonnage goes up, but quality goes down. If you have, on top of all the seed heads you might have, there might be a lot of weed growth as well. So just to kind of take that into account and just think about drying times. Try not to get in the field too much if you have wet soils. It's tough getting that good quality first cutting hay because with cool season forages, we all know that they like to get a seed early in the season. So coming out of dormancy, there's a rapid growth and they like to go reproductive right away. Once we get past the first cutting into the summer, so late summer, fall is when we get typically the second and third cuttings. And they're going to be typically higher quality because that plant is going to stay vegetative and it doesn't want to transition to maturity, to reproductive. And the idea here is that as the plant goes into maturity and reproductive states, whether it's an annual or perennial, so in most of our cases, perennial grasses, they have a lot of structures that stick straight up. So there's a lot of lignin being produced. A lot of the energy does go into the seed head. So a lot of the sugars and the proteins that normally we think of as in higher quality for the leaves, which is what we feed our livestock, isn't really there because it's redirected. It's that source-sink relationship. So for the first cutting, just remember, you're really kind of, let's say, strong-armed by Mother Nature at some point where you can get in there when you can get in there, but just at least be wary of the quality that you might be getting.
Yeah, and there's always a balance on the farm, right? As with anything else in life, you have to balance out whether or not you can get into the field and get the hay cut with how wet is the soil and are you going to cause compaction with the tractor. And if you can wait 3 days after a heavy rainfall before you go out in the field, you will drastically reduce the amount of compaction that you're going to cause as you're trying to get that hay down. And so you're always trying to balance out what is more important to you at this moment in time, your soil quality and protecting it from compaction or getting the hay up before it goes to seed. And so it's a really hard, difficult time in the spring because it's supposed to be April showers bring May flowers, but those of you who do hay, you know that the rains always come right before it's time to harvest the hay, and oftentimes it gets pushed back. But we're just going to try to go over the basics of what you should look for, how you know when your hay is ready to get down, and what you're going to do after you get it down to protect its quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you know what kind of quality you have? Well, you can at least get an idea of the quality based on the maturity of your grasses now. But a forage test is a great way to figure out exactly what you have. And honestly, planting is going to start right now. You're cutting this hay. A lot of people out there just like to get the first cutting and then like to graze the fields that they got the first cutting on. But they're going to base the amount of forage they have for winter feeding on that first cutting. And let's just remember that the first cutting typically is going to be a little bit lower in quality than the second or third, sometimes significantly lower. And those are things because of the maturity of the grass, the reproductive state of the grass, and also the amount. We typically get a lot more rains too, so it's a lot harder to time that cutting and baling, all those things that go into quality hay for the wintertime. So just because you have a lot of hay down doesn't mean it's good quality. And it's just a really good idea to always check the quality of your hay that you're going to feed throughout winter, because that winter is when it's hardest to get weight on calves, or cows even that have calves, to make sure that they are good to go. And at calving time, they're good in terms of a good body condition score to then rebreed. So honestly, I think that first cutting that we put away for winter feeding is very crucial in the way that we manage our farms. And, just because it's not the highest quality doesn't mean that you can't supplement, you can't use that hay later, or even mix it with something else that is a better quality.
And then there's always that ever important, but not commonly enough done step of doing a forage test. A forage test is best 1 to 2 weeks before you feed the hay. So you don't need to do it right now when you're trying to get hay baled and put up and deal with the calves and get vaccinations, and you don't need to deal with it right now. But make sure you do a forage test. And one of the easiest things you could do that will save you time and effort later on is to make sure you know where your first cutting is, where your second cutting is, where your third cutting is. And if you have a good field and a bad field, you want to keep those cuttings separate too. So if you wrap your hay, you can just spray paint on the wrap. If you don't wrap your hay, you can spray paint on the outer edge of that hay. Just try to make sure you have, in some way, shape, or form, identified what hay came from what field, if you have a big difference in your fields, and when you harvested that hay. By just keeping them separate, you're going to be able later on, when you need that high-quality hay, to say, okay, here's my high-quality hay. I'm saving that for my lactating heifers, or here's my poor-quality hay. I'm going to hand that over to the bull, or whatever it is that your management plan is telling you to do. Having that separation, it's a simple step, but it just takes a little bit of prior planning so that you're not moving hay bales around. Because the less you have to handle them, the better quality they're going to keep. Every time you handle that hay, whether it's cutting, tedding, baling, or moving, you are crushing those very delicate legume leaves, and that's going to reduce your quality. So you want to make sure you're protecting the leaves in your hay by baling it at the right moisture content and by moving it as few times as possible.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and look at some hay quality indicators here. And these are nice, and they're going to give you a good ballpark estimate on whether you have something of lower quality, medium quality, or good quality. And of course, the type of forage is always important too. Like Karen was saying, something that has higher legumes in it, whether it's pure alfalfa, mixed alfalfa, or just a good bit of clover in there, that's always going to increase quality because those leaves are typically bigger, there's more leaf area, and leaves are where the proteins are. Remember, the plant is going to want to photosynthesize more than anything, and proteins are essential for photosynthesis, so the amount of leaves that you have in your hay are going to be directly correlated to the amount of protein that you have, which is a huge indicator of quality. So, speaking of protein, something that would have a 5% crude protein when you do a forage analysis is typically going to be low. Medium for mixed grasses, 9%, and good, 12% or higher. Not only for mixed grasses, but for anything. So, depending on where you get your hay, if you're looking at crude protein, if you have a 5% crude protein, and you have a total digestible nutrients of 45%, that's gonna be low in terms of the quality. And here's something to remember too, that depending on the quality of the hay is also correlated to the amount of hay that livestock ingest. So it's kind of a double negative in terms of, you really can't feed enough bad hay to get good nutrition. And in fact, it really works the opposite. So if you have a hay bale that, let's say the indicators are it was first cutting, it was a rough year, you remember a lot of weeds, you remember a lot of seed heads, everything's got over, or possibly it rained on it. So there was that drying period where the quality is slowly degrading anyway, and then it rained and the moisture came back up, and then it had to basically go from that degraded state back down to where it's dry enough for you to bale. That preservation technique, hay is always going to be lower than fresh forage. So the starting point is always going to be highest from fresh, and as you dry it down, you preserve it, but you lose quality. So you get a rain early on, typically it doesn't affect it nearly as bad as halfway to dry, rainfall, and then you have to wait it all over again. So all those things can bring that protein down to 5%. And if you're looking at something that has a TDN of 45%, versus something that has a protein level of 12 and a TDN of 55, then you're looking at from low to good. And for a 1,200 pound animal, you're talking about the difference between a 1.75% intake in terms of the weight of the animal. So a 1,200 pound animal is going to eat 1.75% of low quality hay versus 2.25% of good quality hay. So there have been instances where people have fed low quality hay to the point where their livestock have starved to death. And I'm not saying so I guess my point is the best indicator of what your feeding program is the body condition score of your livestock. Along with that, let's just say you got some hay and you're not aware of it, but your livestock really aren't eating it. If you're curious enough, do a forage analysis. If you have something that's higher quality, switch it to that and see if they eat it now. All those things could be the fact that the cows aren't eating it, the fact that the cows are losing weight and the calves are losing weight, or that the milk production in your animals is decreasing. All are indicators of lower quality hay.
Right. Right. And as Dan had said earlier, all hay is going to be less nutritious than fresh forage. And so if you want your animals to be getting the best nutrition with the least amount of work on your part, maybe you should be considering cutting less hay and rotating your animals more. And so if you're looking at how you can save some labor time and how you can save some fuel costs and tractor hours, then maybe you could look into rotational pasture grazing, where you shrink the size of the paddock that the animals are grazing upon, and you move them from one to the other for a specific period of time, depending on your animal load, your grass type, and things like that. Every farm is different, but stockpiling your forage is an awesome opportunity to not only save you time and money, but to make your animals healthier and happier as well.
So just remember these things in terms of quality and things you can do to increase the nutrition of your animals. So let's just kind of talk a little bit about a 1,200 pound cow requirement. 4 different stages of the cow's life. So we're looking at the animal needs based on when they are in gestation. So usually a cow that's in early gestation needs lower amounts of nutrients. So anything from that low to medium quality hay should suffice for 1.5 pounds of protein and 12 pounds of TDN, or not early gestation period. But as that gestation period goes up, such as in the last third gestation, you need at least minimum hay, which would be the equivalent of the cow actually ingesting 2 pounds of protein and 13.5 pounds of total digestible nutrients. In the lactation phase, the cows really need even more nutrient requirements to maintain that milk production. So you're looking at something like a good quality hay. So this is how you manage the different types of hay and the different qualities you have, so that the animal can produce the maximum amount of milk. And remember that at this stage, even the highest quality hay is going to be really hard to put weight on that animal. That's why it's really important to make sure that when that cow calves, it's at a good body condition score. And that's why it's really important to make sure that you are feeding at least something that'll allow the cattle to gain weight during wintertime. Because if at calving period, once that cow calves and it's feeding that calf, it's really hard to put the weight back on that cow. And if that cow isn't at a body condition score of minimally 4 or higher, ideally. 5 or 6 is what you want. 4 is still pretty good, but anything below 4, where you can really see a lot of ribs on that cow, if that cow is at that point and you're trying to rebreed her, then it's really your success, the likelihood of success for that rebreeding lowers drastically. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that you are being able to put some weight on those cows during wintertime. Because at calving, during that lactation period, that cow is just not going to put any weight. In fact, it's probably going to lose weight. So having a heavier set cow is going to really make things good for you in terms of that cow's potential to reproduce again and maintain that streamline of income that's so crucial for farm living.
That's right. And one of the things that you need to make sure you're thinking about on the farm is what you are doing through the farm paying for the farm, or is it a really expensive hobby? And so it always comes back to, is that animal going to help make you money? What can you do to help that animal make money? And making sure that your management practice isn't costing you more than it needs to.
All right. So just remember, let's go recap some numbers again. So a low quality hay will have a crude protein of 5%, medium 9%, good 12%. A low quality TDN level is going to be 45%, medium is 50%, and good is 55%. And based on the crude protein and the TDN levels are going to be correlated to how much that cow can intake of that hay. So a low quality hay, that cow will only take 1.75% of its body weight. Medium 2%, and a good 2.25%. Those are a little conservative, but those are good numbers to keep in mind in terms of how much you're going to feed also. When Karen was talking about rotational systems, that stuff is really important to know the dry matter of your forages and how much to graze down to make sure that you are meeting those numbers.
Right, and to translate that into pounds, you're going to be looking at a low quality feed at 21 pounds, medium quality feed at 24 pounds, and good quality at 27, and that's your maximum intake for the animals. So noting what your quality of feed is, it's also going to affect how well they eat it. It's just like you sitting down at the dinner table. If it's something you don't like, you're not going to eat as much of it. And if it is just a pile of junk food, you can eat it, but it's not going to give you good health. So those are different things to take into consideration.
Yeah, the only difference is if it's much junk food, I can usually eat more of it. So there is that little caveat that we have to think about in terms of cattle. All right, so now translating that 5%, 5% at 1.75% intake for a 1,200 pound cow would be about 9.45 pounds of total TDN and 1 pound of crude protein. And remember that 1 pound of crude protein doesn't cut it for a lactating cow. So because your ingestion's lower and your crude protein's lower, if you look at the complete opposite side where you have 12% protein and the animal's eating 2.25% of its weight, you're over 3 pounds of protein, which is where you need to be for a lactating cow. And remember, even with that good quality forage, that cow's not going to gain weight. So at rebreeding time, when ideally you want 5 or 6 body condition score, even feeding the best of what you got, if that cow's lactating, that cow's just not going to put on the weight. So the rebreeding becomes more difficult. That's why you got to manage that cow's body condition score throughout the year just to make sure you're going to be successful and you're going to maximize the potential for an income level to your farm.
Now, another thing to consider, if the animals are avoiding the hay or not eating it as well as you would expect them to, you may look through the hay to see if there are any undesirable plant species in the hay that would cause the animal to avoid it.
Or animals.
or yes, if there are little critters in the hay as well, that's always a bad thing as well. Gophers. But anyway, yeah, so poison hemlock is something that we're having to deal with increasingly because it is a plant that kind of grows anywhere it wants to, and it looks a lot like Queen Anne's lace. The only difference in the appearance between poison hemlock and Queen Anne's lace is size of the plant. The poison hemlock is slightly larger, but it doesn't always have to be. But the biggest difference is purple splotches on the stem. So if you're out monitoring your fields and looking for weeds, you got your spot sprayer on you, and you find something that looks like Queen Anne's lace with purple spots on the stem, that is something you definitely need to get out of your field before you harvest it, because that toxin that's in the poison hemlock not only will affect you and can be absorbed through the skin, but also it will persist in the hay. So that toxin isn't one like buttercup that fades away over time. It actually will stay strong and stay persistent in the hay. So if you have poison hemlock in your hay field, you need to get it out before you cut hay. And this isn't something that you want to go out there with a weed whacker or to cut. You want to actually poison it, because if it gets on your skin, like I said before, it can be absorbed through your skin.
Okay, yeah, and remember that poison hemlock is going to be a biannual, so that means it's going to have 2 stages, 2 life cycles, one year, one vegetative 1 year, one reproductive the next. And chances are you're going to be able to identify it only on the 2nd year of when it's reproductive. But it does have a basal rosette leaves. Its stems actually can go up to 2 meters in height, which is about 6 feet. So 6 feet, it's a very tall weed. Typically, you're going to see it on the like over by the fence line. It doesn't, but it can be an open pasture. And if you have, because it's a really resilient plant. And if you have those drought periods where the forage is low, maybe there's not enough water because the forage is low, and there's not that much to eat or drink there. It is a plant that actually holds a lot of water. It has a hollow stem, and it's very toxic. It actually produces an alkaloid called conine, and an alkaloid, if you remember from a lot of the forages that you might have in your field, like Kentucky 31, is always going to be detrimental to livestock. In this case, with this one that is in poison hemlock will actually cause respiratory failure, both in animals and humans. So it's just a real nasty weed. It does reproduce by seed, so keeping those seed heads down, keeping it from reproducing, it's going to go a long way to keep it in control. The first leaf is smooth and got a lot of serration, so 2 or 3 times deeply dissected leaves. It's got, if you look at the leaves, it's very pinnately compound leaves, so you're going to have a lot of leaflets, and it's a pretty look. It's not one whole leaf. It's got a lot of leaflets, and it's I won't say it's like twice dissected.
It's feathery.
Feathery, yes. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah. Multiple leaflets, yes, feathery. And it does have that Queen Anne's lace, flat, panicle-like flower.
Yeah, and so if you see a plant that looks like a Queen Anne's lace, but maybe a little bit different, pay a little bit closer attention to it. Also, there's another weed that is becoming more common. I don't know if it's really reached our area yet, but it's something to watch out for. And it looks the same as Queen Anne's lace, but it has a yellow flower. And it's often confused with wild carrot, but it is wild parsnip, and it can also cause issues with if you eat it or it gets on your skin. So basically, just try to make sure that you're paying attention as you're out in the field and you're looking for these weed species. And when you're out there, do make sure that you are taking care of them. Some other issues that we have when we have high spring rains. Oh, Dan wants me to tell you how to kill poison hemlock first. Okay. All right. So the best control technique or chemical for poison hemlock, and you're going to look at Crossbow and Remedy Ultra for that. I believe Remedy Ultra is a controlled pesticide, so you would need a pesticide applicator's license for that one. But the next level down, the 8th, would include Cimarron Max, Curtail, Dicamba, glyphosate, and then the next level down, I lost my line here, 2,4-D and Forefront. So if you're using 2,4-D and Forefront, you're not going to get as good a control as if you're using Crossbow or Remedy Ultra. All right, so back to heavy spring rains and other problems with animals and toxicity. We have 2 trees in our area that grow naturally here, and they grow quickly. They're great for shade on the edges of pasture field because they grow quick and in very poor conditions, whatever. It is black cherry and red maple, and they're great, but when you get a big strong rain, they're fairly brittle trees, and so they can break easily. And if you get that branch broken off, or it just blows the leaves off into the field, when those leaves wilt, they actually become toxic to the animals. So you do need to be monitoring the edges of your pasture field if you have a red maple tree or a black cherry tree. Black cherry can be identified by its burnt cornflake-looking bark and the oval shape with a point on the end, and they're serrated or toothed on the edge leaves. The red maple has a smoother bark, often has sort of bullseye patterns, and you have your standard maple leaf, which has 3 to 5 leaflets on it. Red maples typically only have 3 lobes, not leaflets, but lobes, where it kind of goes in. It's a deeper tooth. And so if you have, and also with the red maple, it's the opposite branching. So those are just some simple ways to identify the trees that are on your property. And if you have questions about tree identification, I'd be happy to help you with that too.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and look at the black cherry again. So with the black cherry trees, what happens is these leaves contain a compound called glucosianides, and it's a precursor to cyanide gas. So what happens is it's stable if that leaf is undamaged. But when those cherry leaves, you often hear that you should never let livestock graze down branches because the leaves wilt. When those leaves wilt, that compound breaks down, and those cyanogenic glucosides, hard to say, will produce cyanide. And that cyanide, then the cow's basically breathing it in as those leaves wilt and degrade, and it causes, obviously, respiratory failure and death, just like it would in us. And cyanide typically has like an almondy smell. So it's not that it's unpleasant to smell. So I don't think the livestock is deterred by that smell at all. And if you do have a lot of down branches, it's something different, something new. Let's say again, the conditions are bad. There's not enough grass. Now the cows see these green leaves that are slowly wilting, and it looks really good to them, and they eat it, and that could potentially cause death in your livestock because of those wilted cherry leaves.
All right, and we are about out of time. I just want to throw one more thing in there. If your cattle have adequate access to healthy forages, they're not going to graze on things that aren't good for them. They're not that dumb. They do have some thought processes when it comes to choosing their food. So if they have adequate access to healthy forages, they're not going to eat the poisonous weeds as much. They still might. You still need to monitor for that. But if they are hungry, they're going to be more likely to eat the poisonous things that they find out in the field.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.